You're muted now.
We thank you for the example of our forebears, O Lord, in the faith, who have cared for the poor, the sick, the homeless, and the refugee when there was no one else to do so. Help us to be faithful to their example in our own day and age, for the glory of your name and the benefit of our brothers and sisters. This we ask through Christ our Lord. Amen. It's very easy for us to forget, I think, sometimes, that the city of Toronto was initially established as a haven for refugees. We don't think of that very often. The 7,500 loyalists who fled the new United States after 1783, coming to what is now Toronto and other parts, of course, of Ontario and the rest of Eastern Canada, came with very little after they forfeited their farms and their homesteads. They were often destitute and homeless, or near destitution, of course, and many of these loyalists had no other recourse than to plead with the colonial officials here for financial support, causing one author that I love refers to this rather waggishly as the loyalists being Canada's first welfare recipients. Now, surviving petitions like the one that you are looking at here, addressed to the lieutenant governors of Upper Canada in the late 18th and early 19th century, seeking compensation and financial support from the British government. They did so not only for the loss of lands in the United States, but also for clothing and for books, for furniture and personal effects seized by the Americans, which gives us an idea of the state in which they found themselves when they arrived on this side of the Great Lakes. Upper Canada quickly became a place where it was just expected that some form of community support was going to be necessary if a place like Toronto wasn't just going to survive, but was going to thrive. So the history of social welfare in this city, and for that matter, really what would become Canada in those decades before Confederation in 1867, has been described as a sharing of responsibility between the public and private bodies. And that all sounds well and good, but until fairly recently, it was mostly the responsibility of private bodies, and especially the responsibility of churches, which to this day are still playing their active part. In 1837, the colonial parliament, which met here in Toronto, York, passed one of the very first pieces of legislation that specifically targeted social welfare, realizing that we were in a dire situation. And that was called the House of Industry Act. Now, this act allowed that taxes could be raised from the general public to support the establishment of houses for the poor and the indigent. Now, that all sounds well and good, but if you all recall your Dickens, which I'm sure you do, you will know that these were never places anyone wanted to end up in. They followed the British model, and effectively they were prisons, and escaping their demoralizing grip was almost impossible. Well, the Protestant ministers in Toronto realized that almost immediately upon the moment that it was suggested that these things should be erected in Toronto. And so they collaborated with some of the reformers here in the city to establish what became the Toronto House of Industry. And that's the building you're looking at there. That building operated for more than 100 years. But it was based not on the British model so much, but on more humane principles. And eventually it transitioned into a home for seniors, and it was still standing as late as 1848. It had a very long history in the city. The government itself provided very little relief in not only Toronto, but throughout Upper Canada. But what Toronto City Council did do was it provided for a legal framework and some financial resources to allow for voluntary organizations to help where help was needed. And the vast majority of that help came from local churches, both Protestant and Catholic. Now, I think that the challenges that had been experienced by those first American refugees at the end of the 18th century were never forgotten, at least not for probably about the first 50 or 60 years here in the city. And so as a result, further waves of immigration became a priority in Toronto, and that lasted right through the 19th century. Beginning in the 1830s, you have two societies established here in Toronto, both of which were philanthropic organizations that were specifically mandated to help immigrants coming to Toronto. And those were the St. George's and the St. Andrew's Society. The two societies provided a number of things besides helping the resettlement of immigrants. They also provided medical care, food, and financial support as needed. And technically, they were non-sectarian, technically. But the fact is that both of these groups, the St. George's and the St. Andrew's Society, had very informal but very strong ties to the Anglican and the Presbyterian churches in the city and their ministers. The St. George's Society, which of course still exists, it collaborated with the Anglican Church to ensure, for example, that any Englishman or Welshman who came to this city and then died without sufficient funds could be buried free of charge in consecrated ground. And that was no small matter for the families that were left behind, often without a breadwinner in the family. The St. Andrew's Society eventually did the very same thing, establishing a gravesite for the Scottish poor in Mount Pleasant Cemetery, which you can still see to this day. Now, in 1841, just in time for the huge mass immigration of Irish to Toronto, a St. Patrick's Society was established. And why that event was important was because it was composed not of just Protestants and not just Catholics, but Protestants and Catholics who actually worked together to work for the resettlement of other Irish coming during this period of immigration. Now, unfortunately, as time went on, cooperation between the two groups fell apart, particularly in the 1850s and afterwards, so that eventually rival Irish benevolent societies were established that divided on sectarian lines, just as they had been in the old country. Those Irish societies that emerged had very close ties to their respective churches, whether they were Catholic, Presbyterian, Methodist, or Anglican, ensuring that immigrants in each of those cases would not be drawn into accepting charity from someone else from one of the other Irish groups. So not to draw them off into some other religious group effectively. Whatever the history of these societies, the point of each one was to ensure that resettlement here in the city of Toronto went as smoothly as possible, and that at the same time, ties to culture and religion were maintained. But it was the Irish immigration specifically that more than anything else laid bare the incredible weaknesses that there were in the social fabric of this city. Now, as I noted last week, St. Paul's Catholic Church had been established to serve the needs of the growing Catholic population in 1822. 20 years later, Little Trinity Anglican Church on King Street was established in exactly the same neighborhood for the newly arriving Irish Protestants. The year 1847, however, was the main crisis point for the city of Toronto. And I think it's from that year that we can really say social services become a real thing in the city. And why is that? Because in that year, Toronto had a population of 20,000 citizens. Between May and October of that year, 38,560 Irish famine refugees arrived in the city. That's an overwhelming number. It's almost double the number of the actual citizens of the city of Toronto. The refugees well outnumbered the residents, I was to say, almost by 2 to 1. Now, for the most part, the transportation of those immigrants have been paid for by their Irish landlords, and really it was just an easy way to empty their lands of the human misery that they were experiencing during the famine crisis. Technically, when these Irish refugees arrived in Toronto, whether they were Protestant or Catholic, technically they arrived debt-free. But the fact is, they may not have had debts, but they had next to nothing when they got here. Their overwhelming poverty only increased because of the refusal of many Toronto businessmen already established here to offer work to these poorest of the poor. And that's despite the overwhelming sympathy that was expressed for them in all of the local newspapers at the time. To make matters worse, disease came with these immigrants. Michael Power, who was the first Catholic bishop of Toronto, he had been in Ireland recruiting clergy for the city just earlier in that very year in 1847. And he returned to Toronto with a warning for the city's politicians. He said, the Irish are coming, and they are coming in huge numbers, and you are not ready, and the situation is going to be dire. What the city did do was they set up what you're seeing here, a triage center for immigrants arriving at the Port of Toronto. And then when that obviously became not big enough, they started erecting sheds in which to house the many, many sick, so as to prevent them from entering into the city itself and spreading contagion. By June of that year, 1847, it was clear that other officials across Ontario, Upper Canada, were not being very helpful in the situation. We know, for example, that the officials in Kingston were actually sending typhus victims on to Toronto, knowing that they had typhus. By the end of the year 1847, 1,186 migrants died in Toronto, and they were buried in the charity graves either at St. James Cemetery on Parliament for the Protestants or in the cemetery that surrounded St. Paul's Catholic Church on Queen Street. Among the dead was Dr. George Grasset, who was the brother of the Dean of St. James, and he is a hero that happily is now finally starting to be recognized. He volunteered in June of 1847 to be the attending physician in those fever sheds, and he died of typhus himself just 1 month later. Also among the dead was Bishop Michael Power, the first Catholic bishop of Toronto, who died again after contracting typhus during his twice daily visits to the fever sheds to bring comfort to the sick. A monument to Bishop Power stands outside of St. Paul's Basilica. You can still see it on Queen Street there on the left-hand side. And Dr. Grasset is finally recognized and commemorated in a new park that bears his name, which is at the corner of Adelaide and Widmer, which is exactly where the immigrant hospital originally stood where he worked. The devastating effects of the Irish crisis caused by the famine immigrants laid bare the huge crisis in healthcare and social welfare that we had in Toronto at that point. The churches did what they could to bring relief, but when you think about it, how exactly do you care for the needs of your population when there's no infrastructure in place? There are very few schools, and there are even fewer hospitals. And bear in mind that at this time, and for more than a century after this, healthcare is going to be on a pay-per-service basis. And in the missionary period, pre-1850, there was still no strong, centralized organizational structure to coordinate the efforts of the clergy and the churches and the laity alike, especially for the relief of the poor. So it's after the Irish crisis that we first see some sort of organized effort to change the situation within the Catholic community specifically first. And that's given the fact, of course, that the vast majority of the immigrants that had come were Catholics themselves. Now, Bishop Power had already recruited the Irish teaching sisters, the Sisters of Loretto, but they weren't nurses. Healthcare quickly became a priority over education. And so we must turn now to the work of the Sisters of St. Joseph, who founded, among other places, of course, our own local hospital, St. Joseph's Hospital, but that wouldn't be until 1921. The first is that the Sisters of St. Joseph arrived on the 7th of October, 1851, at the invitation of Toronto's second Catholic bishop, de Charbonnel, and they were charged specifically with providing for the needs of the poor, including their health care. They immediately took care of a Catholic orphanage that had already been set up on Jarvis Street. And then 6 years later, in 1857, they opened the wonderful House of Providence. It was a beautiful architectural thing, as you can see here, the House of Providence, which stood near the corner of Parliament and Queen. It was the largest charitable institution in the city at the time. Providence, from 1857 onwards, served as a residence for the elderly. It was a home for orphans, for the poor. It was a hospital for the sick, and it was a refuge for immigrants. Everyone was welcome to free beds and free meals, no matter what their religion was. They didn't care. The sisters didn't care whether you were Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, or whatever. The directory for the city of Toronto in 1859 aptly described it as a place for the indigent, the superannuated, and emigrants. The wide variety of services that the sisters offered at Providence from the beginning reflected Bishop de Charbonnel's vision of a center where the poor were going to be cared for from the cradle to the grave as was needed. Now, in the early years, there was no government funding to support this. So the sisters went door to door and they solicited donations, of course, but what they also did was they took in laundry, which they themselves would wash and then return in order to fund this enterprise. Over time, the sisters built a separate house for the poor and another house for unemployed men on the same property. New wings to Providence were added in 1875 and then again in 1881. And by 1890, there were 530 permanent residents in Providence, not including the 30 nuns who served as nurses, superintendents, and administrators. A few years later, 1870, the sisters began running what was called the St. Nicholas Home for Newsboys. And the point of that was, it was to give a home to boys who were living rough on the streets. Most of them were orphans. They hawked papers during the day, and unfortunately, it is known that some of them prostituted themselves by night. The sisters didn't care. They made sure that they were fed and they were cared for safely. At about the same time, the sisters also opened Notre Dame des Anges house for the girls who had come to the city to find work, and made sure that they had safe places to live in other than rooming houses. In 1875, another congregation of Catholic nuns arrived, the Sisters of the Good Shepherd, and they opened the Good Shepherd Refuge in Toronto, which was specifically for prostitutes. Now, these came to be known in Ireland specifically as the notorious Magdalen laundries, because while they were intended to help women who were trying to get off the streets and back to normal living, these were not the best settings for it to happen. I don't know exactly what the situation was with Toronto's Magdalen Laundry, but I suspect, given that there's very little information about it, I suspect there may have been problems as well. Now, the crowning achievements of the Sisters of St. Joseph and in early social welfare came in 1892 when they opened St. Michael's Hospital. Again, it was intended as a free hospital for the poor of any religion. It had 110 beds, and at the time that it opened, it was the second largest hospital in the city after the General Hospital. And again, open to people of any religion and no religion. Each one of these endeavors gives us just a very small taste, not only of the work that the sisters were doing, but really of the social problems being faced by the disadvantaged in Toronto during the mid and late 19th century. I mean, how many of us really thought about prostitution in the city of Toronto, but also how many of us thought about young boys prostituting themselves in the city of Toronto? The Anglican sisterhood of St. John the Divine, they might have arrived in Toronto later than these Catholic orders, but they were actually the first ones to open a surgical hospital for women. And they did that some 5 years before St. Michael's opened its doors. This Anglican order of nuns was first established in Canada on the 8th of September, 1884 by the woman that you're looking at here, Mother Hannah Greer-Coombe, who hailed from Eastern Ontario and was the widow of an engineer. Now, part of her married life she had spent in England, and it was while she was there that she befriended another order of Anglican nuns, the Sisters of St. Mary. After her husband died, she planned to return to England and join that convent over there. But at the very same time, there were high church Anglicans here in Toronto who were raising funds to establish a convent in this city. And they asked Mrs. Coombe to found it here rather than return to England. And she agreed to do so. She went down to the United States for her novitiate. She then took her vows, and then she and another nun first went to Western Canada and served as nurses in Moose Jaw during the Northwest Rebellion. They finally returned to Toronto in 1885. Within months of their arrival, they acquired this property at the corner of Euclid and Robinson Streets downtown, and this became the very first surgical hospital for women in Toronto. Now, as you can imagine, their presence was controversial among many in the Protestant community. The sight of Anglican women who looked like and lived like Catholic nuns was unsettling, particularly for the members of the Orange Lodge, who were very, very strong here in the city. And they, in fact, threatened to burn this convent to the ground. The sisters persisted, nevertheless, in their work of serving the poor of any and all and no faiths. They also opened a drug dispensary for the sick. They prepared hot meals for the poor, and they provided religious instruction for children. In the end, the Orangemen were not only won over, but they actually started to financially support their activities. The sisters would eventually run homes for the aged in Toronto, as well as the convalescent hospital, with which, of course, to this day, they are still associated in Willowdale. If what I call the missionary period in Toronto then is dominated by important clergymen like Bishop Strawn and Power, Egerton Ryerson, Robert Burns, there is no way you can think about the social safety net in Toronto without thinking about the laity and especially about women, who in the large part were the ones that made sure it happened and made sure it was secure. As we have just seen, the various orders of nuns, both Catholic and Anglican, were absolutely essential in establishing healthcare and education for the poor in this city. But they were far from alone in their efforts, especially as the 19th century grew old and the negative effects of industrialization and the waves and waves of refugees and immigrants stretched the charitable activities of the churches to their utter limits. One of the first important lay groups that worked with the poor, but specifically right in their own homes, was the Catholic St. Vincent de Paul Society, which still survives. It was established in Toronto in 1850. The society was founded in each and every Catholic parish in the city, and it would collect for the needs of the poor, and specifically in their geographical district. The decision that it would be the laity that should collect and distribute the money, food, and clothing was crucial, because what that did was it reinforced the idea that this would be a matter of equals serving equals, not some idea of a top-down act of charity. From the 1860s onward, the St. Vincent de Paul Society started visiting the sick, supplying much-needed medicine free of charge in the home, and procuring the services of doctors, dentists, and nurses free of charge. The society also found living accommodations for newcomers to the city, and when necessary, they even paid the rents. They furnished tools for workers. They provided loans to start small business ventures, and they established libraries to spread the faith, but also to educate the poor. What's interesting in all of this is that since serving the needs of the poor was intended to be a parish-based thing and not a diocesan activity, this actually drove the establishment of new parishes across Toronto in the latter part of the century. So it was a bottom-up movement within the Catholic Church. In 1885, a ladies' auxiliary was founded to take over the visitation of hospitals, which had been done by the male society members. And these same women would also visit female inmates in jails. They would support them in the courts, and once they were released from prison, they helped them to readjust socially to life on the outside. Now, these Catholic women were not alone in providing the social assistance that was so desperately needed across a city that was seeing, by the end of the 19th century, more and more slums rising, especially in and around the areas where industrialization was now forcing the middle class into the so-called suburbs and leaving the poor behind. The establishment of an order of deaconesses in the Anglican, Presbyterian, and Methodist churches was critical to carrying out this vital social work. In the 1860s, the training of the first English deaconesses began, preparing them initially for running Sunday schools, but in the end, they ended up doing so much more about social welfare. In 1890, a Church of England deaconess and missionary training house was actually established in Toronto, consisting of a residential school preparing Anglican women for service both at home and abroad. It's interesting to me, looking at this as long before, of course, the ordination of women, how much like clerics they look in this picture from 1914. The Methodist Deaconess Home and Training School did the very same thing, and they opened the first classes to women in the year 1894, I should say. The Presbyterians, they follow suit at the Ewart Missionary Training Home for Presbyterian women in 1897. The training program for the Methodist women was largely about nursing under a head nurse in a hospital, so that these women could become active in healthcare, both here in the city as well as in the foreign missions. It's interesting that these Methodist women were actually taught at the University of Toronto through Victoria College, Knox College, the Faculty of Medicine, the Faculty of Music, and once it was established in 1904, at the Faculty of Social Work. This, I think, speaks to the growing professionalization of the deaconess's work as time went on into the 20th century. Presbyterian deaconesses in training were also prepared to work in the foreign missions or on the home front. And like their Methodist sisters, they eventually took courses from the Faculty of Music to teach them voice training and elocution. So it was clear they were meant to be speaking in public, which previous to this had been a man's job. In time, these Presbyterian women were even admitted to classes with their male counterparts who were studying for the ministry at Knox College. And these women were trained alongside them in theology and scripture, as well as social services, long before they were allowed to be ordained as ministers. As we move into the 1880s, a seismic shift was about to start among Christians with regards to our collective responsibility to building that social safety net, not only here in Toronto, but all around the globe. By the 1880s, a movement called the social gospel, which had begun in Europe in the mid-19th century, began to have a direct effect, especially on Protestant outreach work to the poor here in Toronto. And that especially was the case among Methodists. They started to understand that the wide variety of the social ills that the churches were facing, such as economic inequality, poverty, alcoholism, prostitution, crime, racial tensions, and the growth of slums, the use of child labor, decline in childhood education, these were all the results of rapid, uncontrolled, rampant industrialization combined with liberal capitalism's focus on individual enrichment rather than communal progress. Now, while most social gospelers still held that humans were saved by Christ alone, they also argued that you couldn't be saved without doing the works of charity and mercy that Christ demanded. To honor God, they argued, you simply had to help others as a matter of justice, not a matter of charity. And that's a huge shift. Wealth was not meant to be amassed and hoarded, but to be shared for the good of all community members, in keeping with Christ's words in Matthew 25. And so the claims of liberal capitalism started to be critiqued by clergy right here in Toronto. At the same time, a new sense of social justice was starting to emerge within Roman Catholicism. It was approached from a slightly different angle, but arrived at the very same conclusion as the Protestant social gospelers, that society needed to return to a sense of natural justice for all if true progress was going to be achieved. These ideas reached their zenith in the papal encyclical that you're looking at there, Rerum Novarum, issued in 1891, which explicitly supported the rights of laborers to form unions. It rejected unrestricted capitalism and demanded that the misery and wretchedness pressing so unjustly on the majority of the working class be addressed and be eliminated. The Methodists, now in particular, looked to their deaconesses to work on behalf of the poor living in the city. And here you can see them in one of their carts. One of their mandatory courses at Victoria College was called Applied Christianity, which effectively meant being schooled in social gospel theology, as well as techniques to develop and implement social reform in society. Another mandatory course that they had to take was on women's leadership. By 1914, the Methodists were turning their deaconesses into professional women by having them enroll in courses taught at the new Department of Social Work at the University of Toronto. Now, returning to the concerns first seen in the 1830s and 40s, the deaconesses were particularly focused on helping with the settlement of immigrants who by the turn of the 20th century were now coming in huge numbers, not only from Britain anymore, but from Southern and Eastern Europe, and we're now settling right in downtown Toronto. By the end of the First World War, Presbyterian deaconesses were doing the very same thing in industrial schools. They were working with prisoners, and they were acting as advocates in juvenile courts. The effects of industrialization were also a prime concern of many of the Anglican rectors who lived and worked in downtown Toronto. As the 19th century turned into the 20th century, they, like their Catholic, Methodist, and Presbyterian counterparts, were doing whatever they could to counter the negative effects of industrialization in the city and meet the increasing needs of the poor who had been left behind as more and more middle-class families moved to better neighborhoods on the outskirts of the city, which, let's face it, is the neighborhood that we are in. Relief of the Anglican poor was originally undertaken at the parish level, much as had been done in the old country. For example, the old Church of the Ascension, which stood at the corner of Richmond and University Streets, it was there that the Reverend H.C. Dixon provided free Sunday morning breakfasts for the poor of the whole neighborhood, no matter what their religion. Out of this endeavor eventually grew a lodging house for the city's homeless, which opened in 1890. Dixon was, I'd say, ahead of his time, and he chose to work in conjunction with other religions, specifically evangelical Protestants, not just Anglicans, in order to improve the living conditions of the growing number of the poor who were left in the downtown core. One initiative that grew out of this ecumenical push was the Toronto Mission Union, a Protestant interdenominational group begun in 1885, which sought to reach the poor and neglected, of course, through Bible classes, yes, but through this storefront soup kitchen. They also had a nursing at home branch with a superintendent and 10 nurses who ministered to the poor free of charge. The group also operated a surgery and a dispensary with a staff of 10 doctors. Anglican efforts for poor relief remained confined to the parish level well into the 20th century. As an example of the lengths to which some ministers went, after he became incumbent rector at Little Trinity Church on King Street East, Reverend Dixon actually turned his rectory into a storehouse for food and clothing for the needy. This kind of piecemeal, parish-by-parish solution to common problems, however, was not enough to meet the challenges that parishes were facing in the inner city as those problems grew. Eventually, it led to the rectors of the downtown Anglican parishes coming together in the spring of 1912 to figure out how they were going to address the many growing social problems that they were encountering, but in a more coordinated manner. The result was the foundation of what was called the Downtown Workers Association, whose job was to help Anglican parishes create their own social assistance programs and train parish volunteers. That association still survives, but is now called Family Services Toronto. The group organized clothing and food drives. They erected a tent in Memorial Park, which was part of the old St. John's Garrison Church near Fort York, where they hosted a well baby clinic overseen by Toronto public health nurses. A free walk-in clinic and dispensary continued to operate at St. John's Garrison Church well into the second half of the 20th century. That same group also organized what were called the fresh air camps, which still exist. They saw the poor taken by train and bus into the country, away from the city's growing pollution problems, even if it were only for a single day. This spread of the social gospel among Protestants and papal social teaching among Catholics was now causing a seismic shift in religious Toronto and was challenging the status quo with regards to how we care for the poor. A change of attitude was definitely in the air, and it was going to make a huge difference in the way churches would tackle the problems they were facing. To this point, from that time in 1813, when the first St. James Anglican Church was actually turned into a field hospital to care for the wounded soldiers during the Battle of York, Toronto Christians had been dealing with problems as they arose on a case-by-case basis. Famine immigrants, poverty, prostitution, illiteracy, truancy, alcoholism. The churches were part of a game of whack-a-mole that tried to face down each social issue as it surfaced. For the most part, however, Christians were dealing with the symptoms of much bigger problems, especially as increased immigration and rampant industrialization gripped Toronto. By the end of the 19th century, there were at least 19 neighborhoods that were designated as slums in the city, the worst of them being the area around where the new City Hall now stands, what was then called the Ward. It had been home to, among other things, the city's Black population, which numbered about 1,000 by the mid-1850s. The Black population had begun immigrating here principally from the United States after the War of 1812, and especially in the years after, leading up to the American Civil War. By mid-century, the Black population had 4 churches in town, 2 African Baptist and 2 African Methodist Episcopal churches, You can see here the unnamed pastor from the Center Street African Methodist Episcopal Church in a sketch that was done in 1855. Not surprisingly, the Black laborers worked in the lowest paid positions, and they struggled to make ends meet, and they were not universally greeted with wild enthusiasm by the white population here in Toronto. And as the derogatory term here used to describe one of their neighborhoods on this very early map, which I have blacked out from the 1855 map, indicates. Their congregations became centers for social welfare for their own people, but they also hosted abolitionist lectures, including Frederick Douglass in the years just before the American Civil War. As the century wore on, clergy and laity of all religious backgrounds were finding it harder and harder to keep up with the demands from places like the ward, where destitution was rampant. It was at this point that the various denominations began to realize several things. First of all, we had to stop focusing on the symptoms of the problems and start attacking the problem itself, which was the social and economic system that allowed poverty to flourish in the first place. This meant, therefore, that the distribution of charity had to start giving way to coordinated fights for social justice at the political level. That then would mean that the religious groups, which had been providing the majority of direct aid to the city's poor, had to start cooperating with each other, no matter what their denomination might have been. At the turn of the 20th century, some Anglican clergy in Toronto began to challenge the accepted model that to this point had been treating the symptoms of these wider social problems. The Reverend E.C. Cayley, for example, challenged the principles of liberal capitalism themselves, and he dared to preach about this very topic to his rather tony congregation at the Church of St. Simon in South Rosedale. Another priest, the Reverend Septimus Jones, who was the rector of the Church of the Redeemer, the corner of Avenue Road in Bloor, he joined the Christian Social Union and encouraged the members of his deanery to address the problems of the day in a more meaningful way than just doling out charity. These priests would gather together and they would study the causes of the social conditions underlying the rampant poverty in Toronto, and then they sought to mobilize the public in their parishes to redress the circumstances leading to poverty in the first place by challenging the political authorities of the city. As you can imagine, this form of Christian socialism was not popular with all businessmen who ran the city, like the Methodist Timothy Eaton, the Presbyterian Robert Simpson, the Anglican George Gooderham. Even within the churches, there was opposition, or at least suspicion, of this new approach, this new Christian socialism. Canon Henry Cody, the rector of St. Paul's on Bloor Street, and eventually the president of the University of Toronto, he actively discouraged his clergy from getting involved, advising them to avoid, quote, leaping into the arena of practical politics or active economic and industrial questions. Among Catholics in Toronto, things were slightly different. There were certainly fewer Roman Catholics who were running businesses or actively involved in politics at the end of the 19th century, so fewer members of that faith would be offended by advocating for Christian socialism or calling for improved living standards for the poor. By the 1870s, the Roman Catholic Archbishop Lynch and his clergy were well aware of the problems that industrialization was causing for Catholics. Catholics tended to be in the lower paid manual labor positions. Alcoholism was a serious issue, as were large families who were living at subsistence levels in neighborhoods that were already prone to disease and crime. While Lynch and his priests and nuns had worked tirelessly to address the effects of industrialization, they didn't really understand the challenge of industrialization itself any better than their Protestant colleagues did at the time. Archbishop Lynch, he gave tacit approval to Catholic workers organizing themselves into unions like the Knights of Labor, but he really did very little when they needed his actual support on the rare occasions that they took job actions, such as during the streetcar strike of 1886. Scholars describe this period of official Catholic inaction at the turn of the 20th century as a time of benign neglect, effectively leaving most everything to the lay organizations that had been supplying the immediate wants of the poor, as they had already been doing for 50 years, without tackling the root causes of those problems. It would only be with the arrival of this man, Archbishop Neil MacNeill, to the Toronto Archdiocese in 1912 that things would change rapidly and dramatically, not only for the Catholic Church and its social services, but for those of all religious backgrounds working for social justice in the city. MacNeill came from Nova Scotia. Before he came to Toronto, he'd been Archbishop of Vancouver for 2 years. He had been studying in Rome in the 1870s, which was the time when Catholic social action was just starting to emerge as an idea, and MacNeill was a convinced advocate. In his initial address to the Catholics of Toronto, he said, "The Catholic Church calls upon us to enlarge our hearts and to widen our horizons. If we are wanting in Catholic charity, we can make it seem that we had no part in the upbuilding of this great nation, as if we were innately selfish, looking after local and small issues. If we are apostolic in our faith and practice, we can Christianize and set aside conflicts between capital and labor and such problems. The power of Christian charity is great enough." His attitude represented a sea change in Catholic thought in Toronto with regards to social action. And perhaps even more importantly, MacNeill insisted, which something none of his predecessors had done, that the Catholic Church had to stop operating within a silo. Catholics had to collaborate with non-Catholics to achieve the social improvements necessary to build up the city. MacNeill spoke for those of all faiths who wanted to see a more just society established in Toronto when he said that social work comprehends not only the care of those in actual want and distress, but it has to do with the prevention of causes of want and stress and the promotion of rehabilitations physically, morally, and vocationally of those who come within the range of charitable activities. Social Catholicism finds its best expression in promoting those measures that prevent unemployment or insure against such periods, in safeguarding against and building up resistance to occasions of accident and illness, in reinforcing by religious and moral power the resistance to vice and family breakdown. It deals with the stability of society by such means as thrift, social insurance against accidents, sickness, unemployment, old age, employment bureaus, a living wage, institutions for safeguarding savings, and loaning money on charitable collateral. In these sentiments, he was joined by clergy of all denominations who were feeling utterly exhausted by the burdens that social relief had been placing on individual parishes and religious organizations for more than a century. What MacNeill was calling for was a more just society in which government and churches would work together, something to which, when you think about it, we are still heirs today in a project that is still sadly unrealized. By 1914, it had become clear that in order to achieve that elusive goal of social justice, Christian organizations could not work in isolated splendor any longer. To that end, Archbishop MacNeill established the Office for Catholic Charities to coordinate the very many Catholic groups operating in Toronto, while Protestants formed the Neighborhood Workers Association, as I say, now the Family Services Toronto, to centralize their agencies as well. And true to MacNeill's hope, the two groups worked together, as the social services directories of the period demonstrate. I would suggest that that was really Archbishop MacNeill's greatest legacy. And when he died in 1934, Albert Moore, the very Reverend Albert Moore, who was moderator of the United Church of Canada at the time, said of him, "Archbishop Neil MacNeill was held in high esteem of the people of Canada, irrespective of creed or nationality. The Archbishop was ever mindful of the general good of all citizens and united in cordial cooperation in many movements which churchmen of other faith wrought side by side for the improvement of the life conditions of the people. He was worthy of the highest tributes of respect and the confidence and affection of the people of all faiths and forms of worship." So over these last 3 weeks, then, we have looked at the ways in which Christians in Toronto's early period influenced the city's culture. This period is known by historians as the long 19th century. It covers the period from 1792, the end of the French Revolution, to 1914, the start of World War I. So next week, we are going to conclude this series by looking at the ways in which the 20th century shaped Christianity and culture in Toronto, but also the ways in which Toronto shaped Christianity and culture into the landscape that we have inherited. Thank you for tonight. Okay.
Thank you for tonight, Father. That was another excellent evening. Lots of information, great pictures, and so much to learn. I'm sure people have questions. If you have a question, just unmute and shout it out.
I've obviously answered everything.
Yeah, there's no questions. It was perfectly clear.
I'm still trying to take in all that was said.
My takeaway from it tonight, Father, was that the Roman Catholic Church was a real leader in this regard. Like there was a lot of leadership shown by that particular denomination. They seem to be first at everything.
It just didn't have a choice in a way, because the refugees that came at that first really desperate group of refugees were Catholics in large part, and so they just had no choice. And you know, I mean, it wasn't immediate. I mean, you think the immigrants, the refugees came in 1847. The Sisters of St. Joseph don't come for another 4 years. So I cannot imagine how desperate Toronto must have been in those years. We can't imagine the overwhelming feeling it must have been to have that many refugees show up, doubling your population. It's just mind-blowing.
Is there some evidence that residents who had previously been there left when these refugees arrived?
More to there is the evidence that many of these refugees, once they were deemed to be healthy, were moved out. So they would get out of Toronto. They would end up in other townships in and around, and many of them, their plan had been to go to the United States anyway. But because they had no control over their passage, they would end up. It was much easier in those days to have ships come if they were being paid for by Irish by the Irish population, to send them directly to either Quebec, Halifax, and from there. But many of them wanted to go to the States. So I think it was more the case that not so much the Torontonians left, but many, once they were able to, got away from Toronto. But that initial overwhelming, it must have been just incredible. That year of 1847 must have been just incredible.
Were there any services specifically for the Jewish population?
Not yet at this point. The Jewish population really doesn't grow in Toronto until into the 20th century. As I mentioned at the end, once you start getting the immigrants coming, particularly from Eastern Europe, particularly after the First World War, that's when you're going to start seeing Jewish, the establishment of Jewish community supports. But previous to 1914, it's not. If you were Jewish and you needed assistance, you would certainly have had the Toronto Hospital. There wouldn't have been any issue. But also bearing in mind that both the Sisters of St. John the Divine and the Sisters of St. Joseph, they operated their facilities without any question about what a person's religion was.
Thinking the deaconesses sound sort of like the female equivalent of what were referred to as medical missionaries.
Yeah, and they were originally established with the idea that they would be missionaries. And it's interesting that people realized pretty quickly at the end of the 19th century, beginning of 20th century, Toronto was missionary territory, despite the fact that you were from Toronto. With so many things that were going on in the city, there was a conscious decision on the part of the Methodists and the Presbyterians in particular to say, no, you are trained as a missionary, your work is here. But it was very much the medical missionaries. And many of them did. When you look at the records, many of them, especially the Presbyterian, Anglican, and Methodist, went off to especially East Asia. You find many of them establishing clinics and being involved in clinics and medical missionary activities over there. Absolutely.
One of my grandfather's cousin was a doctor who trained in the U.S., and he actually established the leper hospital in Chiang Mai.
Yeah,
in Thailand.
I mean, we are so used now to the way in which that governments are responsible for the social services that we forget, were it not for these various religious groups, healthcare would just not have been a reality in many communities, including in the Far East. So we really do owe these people a debt of gratitude for the self-sacrifice. I mean, we may not approve today of necessarily all the ways they did things, but the fact that they were willing to train themselves and go where they were needed, I think it's a wonderful, wonderful legacy. And it's also interesting to see, as I say, pre-1850, the story of the churches in Toronto is very much a male thing. I think once you get past 1850, the story of the churches in Toronto, you can argue it's very much a female endeavor, at least an equally is a female endeavor. And we don't always think of it as that early, but with the arrival of the nuns, and then with the arrival of the deaconesses in the 1880s, it becomes very much an important female endeavor as well. Adrian?
Yeah, we had, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, we had a deaconess at St. Mary the Virgin in the early 1950s. Her name was Miss J, and she wore a navy blue dress with white collar. And she helped the priest in various roles. And I recall that she helped a little bit, not much, with the Sunday school, because I was involved in the Sunday school. But she came and she presented herself as very rigid and very strict, and but did a lot of work. That's the main thing that I recognized.
Yeah, I mean, it's not. When did the Anglican Church start actually ordaining deacons as women as deacons? That be in the 70s? I think I think it was in
earlier than that. Earlier than that.
Like actually, it's for liturgical role.
Yeah, they were ordained before that. Yeah.
So it's important for us to realize that these women that were doing this it was not a liturgical role that they were performing. It was very much, these became professional women in terms of what they were doing in society. It really they've been overlooked in terms of what the work that they did. I'm told that when the Sisters of St. Joseph, if you know Wellesley Street, the Breadalbin Street Convent, which was their main, at one point was their main mother house, was on the site of where all the government buildings there are on the south side of Wellesley Street. And the Ontario government had to negotiate with these women for the purchase of the land to build the Mowat block and all the other ones. And I'm told by some people that were involved in that process that the government was not prepared to deal with professional women, and yet that's what these nuns had been, who had run hospitals and had run schools and universities, and they were not prepared for women. So it's interesting to see how that evolves. And the same thing, as I say, with the Sisters of St. John the Divine, when they first encountered the Orange Lodge in Toronto, effectively they stare down the Orange Lodge and they win. These are tough broads.
So, Father, I just looked it up, and this little Google entry says that Canadian Anglican deaconesses existed from 1889.
Yeah.
But the first woman intentionally ordained as the deaconess was the Reverend Mary Mills in 1969.
Yeah, I was pretty sure that these women had no liturgical role. Yeah.
Mm.
And I don't think that from what I can gather, that wasn't where their interest lay. Their interest lay in doing so effectively social work.
When we did the Doors Open Toronto, scrounging around, I found some old sort of Anglican women's banners that belonged to various parish organizations. And I had no idea what they did. And it turned out that a number of them were very active in fundraising to support the families, the wives and children of missionaries.
Yeah.
So if something happened to the ordained priest missionary, these Anglican women's organizations would pay for the children's education and financially support the wives and widows.
You can imagine pre-death benefits, pre-pension, any of these things. It was crucial that these people were doing this kind of work to provide for the support of their families when the breadwinner was gone now. So they deserve to be better known than they are, I think.
I've never heard those stories before, from the Toronto historical perspective, and it's amazing. It's really interesting, and contrast it with what happened, if you like, in the UK and the differences, because the churches, although they did a great deal, I mean, they set up education and other institutions, but they didn't really go in for social work at all of the kind that you were describing.
Yeah, I think the churches stepped up pretty quickly when they realized they had no choice.
Yeah.
Even, as I say, even going back to 1813, when we forget St. James Cathedral was turned into a hospital during the War of 1812, and that was by Strawn's choice.
Yes, yeah.
The recognition that in the frontier, we have to do what we can to be able to support the community.
It's almost a completely different culture and way of thinking, but you think Canadians and UK, English, British is sort of similar, but that shows that it really wasn't. Sorry to dash off. Somebody rang my doorbell.
No worries. We've gone long.
Well, if that's everything, I think I'll stop the recording for this week.